When we were organizing what what things should go in what order, we didn't think the global part should go first. But we said we have a premium on, we want to get the best people here, and however their flights can manage and so forth, that's how we'll set up the conference. But in hindsight, actually, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, it's actually perhaps the most important one to start with. There's been great gains in human development and economic development over the past 30 years, very much so on a micro level. We'll hear a lot about conditional cash transfers, health improvements, and microfinance throughout the course of the day. And all of that occurred, all of those gains occurred when we thought the envelope in terms of stability and growth was basically taken care of for us. We learned the hard way in 2008 and are continuing to learn now that we didn't quite get that envelope right. That in order for development to occur in the longer run, you need an envelope of financial stability and the right kinds of ingredients to foster broad-based economic growths for some of these more micro approaches to be able to really take hold. And we've learned the hard way after the financial crisis. We've seen 50 to 75 million people move back across the global poverty line as administered by the World Bank. We've seen the lack of the ability to regulate financial markets to, in part, cause two major food price spikes that have brought another 50 or so million people back into poverty. We're in the middle of one right now with massive food price volatility. And now as we move into a period of austerity and debt reduction, many of these innovative programs in health and education and industrialization and so forth are some of the first to be cut. And so our first panel is looking at what is a role of the state on a national level, what are institutions for global economic governance that can help us get this envelope right, which we've learned now is so important. How can we put in place national policies for growth and financial stability, and how can they be coordinated on a global level? That's what we're going to be talking about in our first panel. And I couldn't be happier with the three folks that we have here on the to save time and have them do most of the talking. I'll let you look at their specific bios in your packets, but let me just introduce them quickly here. Our first panelist who will speak on industrialization in the wake of the crisis is Robert Wade, a professor of political economy and development at the London School of Economics. Our second panelist will be Gerald Epstein, economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the co-director of the renowned Political Economy Research Institute. And then we have Amar Bhattacharya from the G24 and also a longtime economist at the World Bank. We'll be going in that order. We'll be looking at national strategies for growth and industrialization, and then talking about the global economic architecture. Each one of these folks will speak for about 15 minutes. I'll be hard on that, and then we should have a lot of time for questions and answers. So thank you again for coming, and look forward for a great day.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about industrial policy, or the return of industrial policy. This is a very exciting time for students of development studies because for all the wrong reasons, the mainstream of development thinking has crash-landed on hard facts. And so in the wake of that crash landing, there is quite a lot of rethinking going on, for example, on issues of capital account management, issues like should there be a presumption that all countries should open the capital account, liberalize capital flows, but also there is rethinking going on the question of industrial policy. And it's driven partly by hard events, global events. You couldn't watch the television news coming out of the Middle East and North Africa without hearing somebody in one of the squares saying, I don't have a job, I need a job, I can't live on my income. So this underlines very graphically the massive problem of unemployment in very many developing country regions. And that problem has risen to much higher up the political agenda than it had been before this financial crisis. And secondly, there is realization, a kind of crystallization out in Latin America of what has happened to Latin American manufacturing capacity. And the summary story is best captured by two statistics. Both relate to the ratio of manufacturing in Latin America to Latin American GDP. So in 1980, the ratio of manufacturing to GDP in Latin America was 27%. In 2008, it had fallen from 27% to 18%. That is about the same as the level in the Eurozone, which of course has a very much higher level of per capita income. And by the way, that ratio in East Asia is, in 2008, 31%. So that illustrates just how much Latin American manufacturing capacity has been wiped out, and to a considerable extent because of cheap imports from the manufacturing workshop of the world, China. And the third example is perhaps the most dramatic of all, and was told to me by one of my students who lived in the capital city of Mali. Mali, the landlocked West African country, very poor country, and who told me that in the mid-2000s, carpenters in Mali found that their market for making doors they were being outcompeted in this market for doors by Chinese door makers in China manufacturing plywood doors, putting them on ships around the Horn of Africa, putting them on trains in Senegal, 1,000 kilometers up to the capital of Mali, and able to land those doors cheaper than Malian carpenters. That, I think, is a truly astonishing fact, because, of course, we're talking of a low technology item with high transport costs, you would have thought. So all that is on the one hand. On the other hand, for 3 decades, global policy, that is the policy espoused by organizations such as the World Bank, but also the US Treasury, also UK DFID, organizations which claim to think for the world. That's what I mean by global policy. Global policy has, about industrialization, has centered on a single dominant argument. This argument makes a crucial distinction between 2 forms of industrial policy. One of them is horizontal industrial policy or functional industrial policy, and the other one is vertical or sectoral or selective industrial policy. And the mainstream argument that has dominated thought for the past 30 years or so is that in some circumstances, horizontal industrial policy is okay. That is okay in developing countries. That is, for example, there may be problems in capital markets such that small and medium enterprises have difficulty getting credit because of capital market failures, and therefore there may be a case for the government to give some subsidies for credit to small and medium enterprises. But the key thing is that the credit must be equally available to all small and medium enterprises, regardless of the sector that they are in, or similarly there may be failures in the market for R&D funding, and therefore there may be a case for some subsidies to R&D, but the critical point is that these subsidies must be available for all R&D in any sector. The mainstream argument goes on to say that industrial policy of the vertical kind, or the sectoral kind, or the selective kind, that is prohibited. No governments anywhere, whether the United States or Mali, any government in between, should do vertical policy. And the what is called the industrial policy debate really focuses on this second type, because there's not much debate about the first type. The argument is that all governments should avoid vertical or sectoral industrial policy. Why? Because, and this is the core proposition, governments are not good at picking winners, but they are good at picking losers. And so that Gary Becker, for example, said the best industrial policy is no industrial policy at all. My colleague at LSE, Tim Lunig, said just a few months ago in the British journal Prospect, quote, "The UK government should be providing conditions that help all businesses. We should make no attempt to pick winners, whether specific companies, specific sectors, or manufacturing as a whole." So in his view, you either have governments improving the conditions of all business, or you have governments trying to pick winners, and governments must not pick winners. I did research in the World Bank over the last summer, and I recurrently came across people, economists in the bank, who said things like, for every career there are 100 failures. Who would you put your money on? And the underlying proposition for these people was that the state capacity, the capacity of the state in the countries that the bank deals with, is simply not adequate to support effective vertical or sectoral industrial policy. When I asked these people, well, how do you know? I mean, how do you measure state capacity? They didn't have a clue. State capacity for them was the end of the argument. You didn't need, like in theological discussions, we have a theologist here, when you trace back questions to God, that is the end of the discussion, because you can't go beyond God. And similarly for these people, state capacity was the God-like position in the debate. You just had to say, our countries don't have the state capacity, and that was the end of the discussion. But this attitude that I'm talking about is not just at the level of words. It's very important, especially when you hear people like Danny Roderick say, with a wave of the hand, it's fair to say nobody believes the Washington Consensus anymore. When you hear people say that, what you should know is that for some decades, the World Bank has used a particular formula for ranking countries according to the goodness of their development policies and their development institutions. And this formula is known as the CPIA, or Country Policy and Institutional Assessment. And so that every year, from September to May, the bank goes through an exercise whereby every country that it that it lends to is ranked on a whole lot of criteria. For example, on trade policy, Uganda, Brazil, China will be ranked according to criteria of the goodness of their trade policy. The question is, what are these criteria? Well, it turns out that to get the top score of 5 under trade policy, you, the government, have to have a completely free trade regime. That is, practically zero tariffs, no variation between sectors, that is, no use of trade policy to promote particular sectors, and no restrictions on exports. Similarly, in labor markets, to get the top score in labor market institutions, you have to have practically zero worker protections, except, of course, slavery. That's out. But other than that, any sort of power of trade unions lowers your score because they represent frictions in the labor market. So my point is that the World Bank has crystallized out or institutionalized these core ideas that I've just been expressing, and has been using these ideas to inform its country dialogue, and also in terms of low-income countries to decide how much loans to lend to the low-income countries. So that's the state of things at the moment. But there is an important new development in terms of global policy norms, that is, in terms of what the World Bank is thinking, or to be more exact, there are some important new developments in parts of the World Bank. And in particular, three things have happened internally to this important global policy norm generating organization, the World Bank. One, the appointment of Justin Lin as chief economist in 2008, the first ever non-G7 chief economist. Important, however, he has a PhD in economics from Chicago. So he's Chinese, but he's also one of us because he's got a PhD in economics from Chicago, so he must be all right. And secondly, a new vice president for the finance and private sector development vice presidency of the bank came in at the beginning of 2010 from McKinsey and named Mr. Devon, and he is quite interested in industrial policy from a kind of McKinsey point of view. And the third important internal development, which is changing the kind of mean, the center of gravity in World Bank thinking, just a little, but with lots of fighting going on inside. The third important development is that the bank's independent evaluation group, called IEG, Independent Evaluation Group, put out a report on this CPIA. And to my complete astonishment and my delight, they said that there's no good empirical evidence for quite a lot of these scoring criteria, such as the labor market one, such as the trade policy one. And so, very slowly, very reluctantly, the bank is beginning to revisit the scoring criteria of the CPIA. So let me just elaborate a bit about Justin Lin's thinking. Lin begins with the point that mainstream thinking about economic development for the past 30 years or so has very much thought of development as a process of raising consumption. So it's focused on the business of consumption. Lin says, but there's another part to development which used to be dominant before the 1980s, but was then eclipsed by all this neoliberal thinking, and that is a production notion. The notion of development as increasing not just the quantity but also the quality of production. And this notion of production becomes particularly important in the context of globalization, that is, globalization of production, that is, the fragmentation of value chains and their dispersion in many geographical areas. The point being that this opens opportunities for firms in developing countries to find niches within these fragmented value chains that used not to be available. And Lin's point is that the government can play an important role in helping firms in developing countries enter these kind of niches. And Lin has laid out 6 steps, what he calls 6 steps to industrial upgrading and economic diversification. He's laid out these 6 steps in a number of places, but I particularly recommend you look at his statement in the journal Global Policy. I want to draw your attention to this journal. It's an LSE journal. It's relatively new, and it's a really, really interesting journal with lots of debates in it. I had a paper on industrial policy and the developmental state in Global Policy in early 2010, and Lin wrote his paper on 6 steps in response to my paper. So look at the website, Global Policy. The first of Lin's steps is that the government of a developing country should look at the list of products and services produced in dynamic economies which have a per capita income of roughly 100% higher than the country in question. So the country in question finds other countries with per capita incomes roughly 100% higher and looks to see what products and services are being produced and have been produced for, let's say, roughly 10 years or so in that country and are being exported from that, and perhaps are being exported from that country. And this list then gives a first cut, just a first cut, as to what the government of the country in question might select for particular promotion. And if you look at what the Japanese did in the 1950s, what the Koreans, the Taiwanese did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they were doing very much the same kind of thing, looking to see what things were being produced by countries which were ahead of them in the income hierarchy. And then Lin suggests a number of other steps, including, of course, the government has to look at its own economy and see what things are being successful in the early stages of success that might be accelerated by some government assistance of various kinds. So that's sort of betting on the strong, betting on the likely to be strong. He lays out these 6 steps in some detail, and I'm being signaled that I have exactly 1 minute left. So I'm going to shortcut the description of his 6 steps. I'll just leave you with the main point, which is that especially in the wake of the external event of the global financial crisis, which throws into question a lot of mainstream thinking, and secondly, the internal event of the arrival at the World Bank of this non-G7 chief economist, to be exact, from China, plus the arrival of this vice president from McKinsey, who's seriously interested in operationalizing Lin's 6 steps. The whole debate is changing inside the bank, at least a little, but there is, as I said, a lot of pushback within the World Bank. However, the bank is, this vice presidency that I mentioned, finance and private sector development, is piloting these programs to put these general ideas into practice. The first pilot is in Kenya, which is underway now, but other pilots are being rolled out as we speak. And so this is something which is well worth keeping an eye on, both in terms of what is happening in the debate inside the World Bank, but also what's happening on the ground in places like Kenya and where the other countries where it's being piloted. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Gerald Epstein from UMass Amherst.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here this morning. The title of my talk is Macroeconomic Policy and Institutions for Egalitarian Development, and it operates in the interface between the global institutional structure for macroeconomic policy and the national institutional framework. The context, of course, is the global economic crisis and recovery that the world has been facing. And as you can see from this graph, which looks at the number of countries, the bars are the number of countries that are in economic contraction. And as you can see, that the number of countries in the world in economic contraction went up substantially during the crisis, but has now started to fall. And the line which shows rates of GDP growth, which were negative during the height of the crisis, but have now recovered to some extent. Yet, as the next graph shows, the recovery is uneven, and there's still a very large problem of unemployment and underemployment in the world. And there's no signs worldwide that this problem is going to be fixed anytime soon, though there are important pockets of rapid economic growth and employment recovery. Globally, the unemployment rate stood at 6.3% in 2009, and there was no decline within the last year or so. Among the youth, the unemployment rate is much higher, 12.6% globally, with the employment participation rate among youth well below what one would have expected had the economic growth continued. About 1.7 million fewer youth worldwide in the labor force than one would have expected projecting forward from the economic growth that we experienced before. And then, of course, there's the working poverty rate, which is probably the best measure because most people in the world can't afford not to work. and the working unemployment poverty rate, that is people who work but are still poor, less than $1.25 per day, is 20.7% of the global population, and this is probably an underestimate. So my talk is how can we use macroeconomic policy within the global context, but at the national level, to deal with the employment and poverty problem in the world. And of course, this is not the only problem we're facing. Indeed, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is how some of the tools that I'm going to be discussing can be used to orient employment to particular social needs in the context perhaps of industrial policy, as Professor Wei just spoke about, to generate more kinds of green employment or green jobs, if that is something that we are particularly concerned about in the current context. But if you just look at the employment problem generally for a moment, there's a quantity problem. Quantity is inadequate. There's the quality problem. The quality of jobs in many parts of the world are inadequate. And the key then is to deal with both of these. Whoops. There you go. And what I'm going to be talking primarily about, and I'm not going to use the PowerPoint presentation through the whole thing because I don't have enough time, but what I'm going to be talking primarily about are monetary policy and financial policy and exchange rate policy to some extent within the context of capital management techniques, which I think Amar might be talking also about to some extent. And the question is, what contributions can these kinds of macroeconomic policies make to reducing the employment and poverty problem that we face? Fiscal policy, of course, is important, but I'm not going to have time to speak about that as well. So talking about then the first topic, central bank policy. How can central banks around the globe operate as agents of employment creation? And the answer is, under the current dominant view of central bank policy, the answer is very little. The current dominant view of central bank policy is that central banks around the globe should be oriented towards inflation targeting. That is, they should have one primary goal, which is to keep the commodity rate of inflation at a low and stable level. And they should use only one tool of economic policy to do this, primarily short-term interest rates. And this is a policy that has been promoted by the IMF and many economists around the world to developing countries as an example of the best practice the central bank should follow. And it's a policy that, in my view, is mistaken and needs to be changed. Now, if you think about it, what are some of the key factors that can affect employment? Well, it can be affected by the amount of credit available for investment. It can be affected by the real exchange rate, which will determine the competitiveness of exports and import competing industries. It can be affected by public investment and infrastructure that can underpin and promote more employment-generating economic activities. And central bank policy has the capacity, in principle, to affect, not completely determine, but to affect all of these things. By keeping a competitive and stable real exchange rate, by keeping the cost and availability of credit at the macro level at a reasonable level, by helping to allocate credit as part of an industrial policy program to those sectors that can thrive and can generate employment and can achieve other social goals. These are all things that central banks can do. These are all things that central banks historically have done. But these are all things that central banks can no longer do if they are operating under the regime of inflation targeting. Because under inflation targeting, they have one goal, keep inflation stable and low, and one instrument, usually a short-term interest rate. So this, what I call the neoliberal approach to central bank policy, it has to be changed. And there is a lot of historical precedent for alternative kinds of central bank policies. Indeed, if you look at central bank policy in the currently developed countries, the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, Europe, and so forth, during important phases of their industrial growth, their central bank policies had components of all of the elements that I just described. They supported forms of industrial policy to greater or lesser extent, depending on which country. They had multiple tools. They had credit allocation policies, loan guarantee policies, subsidized credit policies that they implemented. And they also, almost every single one of them, used some form of capital controls or capital management techniques so that they could keep the credit, to some extent, that existed inside the economy bottled up there so it could be allocated for productive uses, and to prevent unstable capital flows from coming in and undermining macroeconomic and financial stability. Now, in the current environment, under inflation targeting, with short-term interest rates being pretty much the only tool of monetary policy, and under a regime of financial liberalization, which was also part of this overall scheme, it makes it very difficult for central banks that want to generate more employment, that want to lower cost of capital, to do so in such a way that it will actually generate real investment and real growth. Why? Because under the current environment of financially liberalized financial markets, lowering interest rates, expanding credit, can lead primarily to asset bubbles rather than increases in real investment. That's one of the lessons that we have learned from the past 4 or 5 years of monetary and macroeconomic policy. In countries that have been able to channel credit using industrial policy and broad central bank techniques of the type that I'm talking about, have been able to channel credit to real investment and real industrial development. But countries that have not had complementary techniques to loose credit policy by central banks have found that they're experiencing various kinds of asset bubbles that, as we now know, eventually burst. Let's look at the example of quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve, a very controversial policy now to try to maintain economic growth, restore economic growth and employment in the United States. Well, one of the impacts of this policy, as Kevin Gallagher and others have written about, is that credit is spilling over from the United States, pouring into developing countries and generating asset bubbles there. And those countries do not have the tools, many of them, to deal with this problem. Now, there are two solutions to this problem that relate to the points I'm trying to make. Number one, if the United States had a more adequate credit allocation policy, this credit creation that the Federal Reserve is engaging in could be allocated to more employment generation and deal with increases in real investment. On the developing countries side, if they had complementary tools to deal with this inflow of capital to their countries, they too could benefit from having access to more credit, rather than finding themselves buffeted by this massive avalanche of credit that's pouring into their countries, generating overvalued real exchange rates and promoting asset bubbles. What are some of these complementary policies? Well, the first important policy for developing countries is capital management techniques. That is, ways to reduce the quantity of short-term hot money inflows, and these techniques can involve taxes on capital inflows. They can involve reserve requirements on capital inflows. They can involve actual banning of capital inflows of certain types into their countries. That way, then they can take the useful longer-term capital inflows that are coming in and allocate them to productive uses. The second complementary measure is credit allocation techniques, partly done with the help of the central bank. So that's what I want to turn to now. The general point is the old point made by Jan Tinbergen, who was one of the first winners of the Nobel Prize. he said, you need as many policy instruments as you have targets. So if we are to broaden the target set of central banks around the world, that is, from just keeping inflation at a stable level to dealing with asset bubbles to helping to generate employment, then we have to go back and expand the number of tools. We have to increase the toolkit the central banks have. And indeed, we don't have to, as I just suggested, reinvent the wheel, because historically central banks have used all of these kinds of tools. So we've talked first about expanding the goals and toolkits of central banks. I've spoken briefly about capital management techniques. I want to end up with talking about credit allocation techniques and the various kinds of tools that central banks can use to help direct credit for more employment generation. There are a number of different tools that central banks have used and can use. First of all, there are loan guarantees. Central banks, historically and around the world, can offer loan guarantees to certain kinds of investment that are likely to promote employment, particularly in sectors that are going to be competitive, or if there are other social goals like promoting green investment. Subsidized credit has often been used as a way of promoting certain kinds of sectors in the economy. So for example, if the central bank wants to generate more female employment for female-headed households in a poor developing countries, then central banks can give subsidized credit to micro-lending institutions that have a special goal of generating more female employment to help reduce female poverty. If the central bank, as part of the development plan, has a goal to generate more green employment, it can use similar tools, subsidies, loan guarantees to promote that. Now, to get back to the issue that Robert Wade talked about, state failure. Clearly, state failure has to be addressed. Clearly, corruption has to be addressed. Alice Amsden, who many of you probably know, you've read her work, The Rise of the Rest, and Professor Wade also wrote some important work on this topic, speak about the importance of monitoring of these kinds of policies, credit guarantees, subsidized credit, the importance of monitoring these kinds of activities to make sure they deliver the goals that they are intended to deliver. And there are many different ways to engage in this kind of monitoring. For export-led growth economies, the monitoring, as Professor Amsden wrote about, was very simple. You just looked at how much exports are being produced by these techniques. If you have other kinds of goals, employment in particular sectors, or employment by women, or investment in green technology, you have to tailor the monitoring to those goals. So the monitoring is one important mechanism that has to be put in place, or these techniques are going to fail. Second, whistleblower policies. They're being used more in the United States. They're being used more in other countries. Paying whistleblowers, if they 0 minutes? So the whistle has just been blown on me. So whistleblower techniques to pay whistleblowers who find corruption will get paid if they are able to prove that that corruption has taken place and come forward. The overall point is, in the face of these multiple crises that we have now, we have to adjust the kinds of macroeconomic policies that are taking place at the domestic level. To do that, we have to change the policy proposals that are coming down from the global governance institutions to create the policy space so that these kinds of new policies can be undertaken. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Adil, for inviting me to participate here. I'm going to speak, as the title here says, on global development finance, and in particular on a new architecture. But before I do that, three caveats. First is I spend every day, every minute on global economic governance, and I'm not going to speak about that right now, but I'll be happy to come back to it in the discussions. Second, I do believe that country actions actually are more important than global actions, and I'll not speak about that. And third, development finance is only one part of the broader development cooperation framework in very much the kind of sense that Robert Wade spoke about, which is the realm of ideas. But let me begin, since I'm going to talk about a new global development finance architecture, by talking about the old architecture and what was wrong with it. The intellectual antecedents for the old architecture goes back to a lot of discussions in the 60s, including here in this university. And it started with something called the two-gap model, which is that at an early stage of development, developing countries face two constraints, a savings constraints and an access to foreign exchange for imports, and foreign savings can help alleviate both these constraints. The second intellectual antecedent for the role of foreign savings comes from the experience of the 70s and the 80s, the fact that developing countries suffer shocks, including both inflicted shocks and self-induced shocks, and that adjustment and policy reforms can help respond to that shocks, leading to the infamous structural lending of the 1980s, but with the notion that policy reforms and policy financing is important. And the third intellectual antecedent comes from a lot of the discussions in the 1990s, which is the world should have some collective goals of human welfare. These are the so-called Millennium Development Goals. They need to be financed, and this was very much the discussion in the last decade, including the Gleneagles commitments to double aid and more than double aid. So those are the intellectual antecedents. How has the architecture evolved in practice? The main pillars have been bilateral aid programs, which came about in the beginning in the 1960s in big form. The MDB financing model, the World Bank, the regional development banks, where you put in a little bit of money in capital and you mobilize most of it in the market and you lend to countries who are not creditworthy, and the concessional windows of the multilateral development banks. The second aspect to point out is there was huge proliferation in the system. Bilateral programs grew from 50 in the 60s to now more than about 70 bilateral programs. Multilateral programs have grown from 50 in the 60s to about 200 right now, and even within an organization such as the World Bank, there are more than 1,000 trust funds. Accompanying this is a third element, which I call the overload of mandates, the proliferation of conditionalities, safeguards of every kind, and all of it really reflecting not the view of the recipients, but the view of the bank or the view of the donors. What has changed in the last 5 or 10 years is the emergence of new players, in particular of two kinds. The emergence of big private foundations. Gates today finances more in vaccines than the entire G7 put together. And the second is the emergence of new partners or new donors, countries like China, India, and Brazil. These countries, for example, China, India, and Brazil, today finance more infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa than the entire developed world, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank put together. So the next point I want to talk is what have been the results of this. And the results of this have been that have been measured in a big literature on aid effectiveness. It's actually a very flawed literature in my view. I won't get into that. But since I'm talking about finance, let me focus on the volume of finance. This just is the example of the proliferation. So here's a story about the volume of finance. And you can distinguish between grants that go primarily to the low-income countries, and you can differentiate between loans which go both to low but primarily to middle-income countries. And what this shows you is that the hamlet of finance, which was official lending to developing countries, has essentially fallen to levels that is insignificant in the scheme of things. In fact, in the last 10 years, it has actually been negative. Okay? And if you look at the World Bank as an example, the concessional window is small, steady at about 5 billion, and the main arm of the World Bank is actually withdrawing money from the developing countries. Okay? I'll come to the factors underpinning this, but one of the main factors, in a good sense, has been the developing countries, partly because they adopted some good things from the Washington's consensus, and partly because they did some things that were not part of the Washington consensus, improved their own savings dramatically since the mid-1990s. And you see that here. And it's not just a story of Asia. It's actually a very broad-based story, including, as you might see in the second panel, about sub-Saharan Africa. The second part of it has been, what's very well known, is the emergence of private capital flows. And you can see the yellow line, which compares official flows, with the green line, which is private capital flows, and the contrast is enormous. In the year just before the crisis, private capital flows to developing countries amounted to $1 trillion. Official development assistance, which went to low-income countries for this MDG effort, as I put it, amounted to about $100 billion. Official financing in the form of loans, the World Bank, etc., amounted, compared to that to the $1 trillion, official financing was only $12 billion. In other words, entirely irrelevant. Now, despite this private financing being there, the crisis has shown that this financing is actually comes with large hidden costs. It's very pro-cyclical, it's subject to sudden stops, and it is subject to very high risk premia. Second, this private capital flows that comes in is misleading, because offsetting that private capital flows are large private capital outflows in two forms. In a private form and in the form of reserve accumulation, because countries need to protect themselves against the potential instability. The net result is that capital has been flowing out of developing countries rather than flowing in. I often like to say that developing countries export safe capital and they import risky capital. So this reliance, in some sense, on private capital is actually been quite misleading. Now, why has this been sort of irrelevant? In part because developing countries have actually grown pretty well without official finance. And this is not just a China story. I use this as a way to illustrate that by talking about the dispersion of growth. Of 155 developing countries, 130 were growing more than 3% in the period before the crisis. That has never happened in history. This is not just a story about China, it's a story about now convergence big time. There was a paper that Pritchett wrote about 10 years ago called Divergence Big Time. Well, what this tells you is we are seeing convergence big time. So if this is the story, why should we worry about global development finance? And the answer is, first, that developing countries remain still very highly prone to shocks, commodity shocks, food and fuel prices, as we are seeing, reverses in capital flows. But the more fundamental reasons are developmental. And that is, the world remains largely bimodal. Developed countries, for example, have a per capita income of about $100 to $120 per day. Emerging markets, the so-called successful ones, have a per capita income of about $12, but most on a population-weighted basis, it's only 5, and low income 2.5. And you see that here. But the other thing is that the development needs are very, very large. There's the need still on the MDGs, agriculture and food security, infrastructure financing. India, for example, has put out an infrastructure program of about $1 trillion for the next 5 years. Brazil has put out an infrastructure of about $1 trillion plus. There's no financing for it from own resources. Climate mitigation and adaptation is a big thing on top of that. And these are some estimates of these numbers. Now, where does this financing come from? And this is where the new part of the architecture comes. The financing no longer has to come only from the rich countries. Increasingly, the incremental sources of wealth and financial wealth are actually in the developing countries themselves. Today, the developing world is sitting on top of 5 trillion of official assets, at least 5 trillion of private assets. What do we do with it? We put it in Wall Street and we finance the US budget deficit. Why not use it for developmental purposes? Well, one beautiful instrument for doing that is the multilateral development bank system. But why are we not able to do it? And the reason for that has to do ultimately with economic governance, in particular the way in which these institutions are governed. We went through a very, very difficult discussion of capital adequacy for the World Bank. And the developing countries said the capital of the World Bank after this crisis should at least be doubled. The developed countries said, no, maybe a third. What would a third do? It would allow the World Bank to lend at the same level as it did in the 1990s, which is irrelevance. Now, why is it that the developed countries said no to this increase in capital? Is it because of money? We said, no, don't worry, we'll put all the money behind it. We don't need your money, but just stand aside. We would like to, of course, take control of these institutions. And that's where the struggle is. Because the developed countries don't want to give up their voice and their dominance in this institution, we are relegating these institutions to irrelevance. And you see that also in the whole discussion of voice and governance in the IMF, in the World Bank. But we are at a moment of change in the sense that if we can get the developing countries organized, we do not need, in some sense, to rely on the institutions of old. So we have two options to pursue. Either we reform the existing institutions, such as the World Bank and the regional development banks, or we create new multilateral institutions, largely dominated by the South, which channels the savings of countries like China, the 5 trillion assets that I mentioned, and use that for development purposes to make a big push of the kind that Robert Wade talked, that Justin Lin is pushing, of a big push on infrastructure, big push on public goods, and we do not rely on fickle private finance to finance that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three very interesting and provocative speakers. I think we have a good half hour for questions and answers and comments from all of you folks. How are we working this? Are there folks out there with microphones or no? Yeah, so we have Cynthia in the back with a microphone. And I think what I'll do is take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll let the panel answer them, and then take 2 or 3 more. Please limit your questions, make them fairly short so that we can have a good and rich half-hour discussion. So we have a gentleman here in the front. Yeah, he can have the first question.
Thanks so much. It was great to have these 3 together. I particularly appreciated Amar's, I must admit. I should preface what I'm saying by saying that I led something called the Global Finance Initiative, which was an investigation into the global finance system from 2 points of view. One was, what are the global public policy organizations that are creating the global finance system that we have, and 2, who are the stakeholders in that global finance system. So it made me realize that we've start from two different points, I think, the economists versus what I would say Amar and I are starting from. The economists are starting from the point of view that it's the macroeconomic policy that produces the financial system, whereas I would argue that it is the financial system that is producing the macro policy outcomes. So it seems to me that we had a lot of wishful thinking. If the US had, if the development countries had, et cetera, the question is, why don't we have this sort of situation? And the other singular assumption in the analysis, I think, of everyone is about the importance of the national unit of analysis, that is, countries we continually speak about, such as with the World Bank as being a product of country organizations. It's really a story of historians. What about the future? Amar started pointing that way. So, how to change the global policy institutions is a very interesting question.
Thank you. Let me let other folks ask questions too. You've got two in there. Thanks a lot. I want to make sure other people.
Well, I haven't finished quite
yet,
though.
What are the questions?
I don't think, if you
All right,
may.
please,
okay.
Please keep it brief.
So the question is, what are the players that are not being represented in the institution? Who are the stakeholders? So number one, how is policy made? It's made basically by central banks heavily under the influence of the private sector and the investment companies, et cetera, private capital, status quo. What about all of the other stakeholders? What about the asset owners? What about the consumers? How do we make them part of this policy? How do we create active models that consider power and that the power of the status quo that is producing these stalemates in outcomes? So how do we create a dynamic model of what finance is about in its relationship to the macroeconomic policy?
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to stress to keep your comments short so we can have let a lot of folks intervene. And when you ask a question, please introduce yourself to all of us. So we're going to be talking with each other all day. Why not get to know each other a little bit? So another question. We'll take a handful and then we'll have the panel answer. Questions, comments? Some provocative stuff here. I don't believe, and there's good coffee, so I don't believe that there's nothing to say.
This is just a short question, not a speech. I'm Mark Rosenzweig. I'll be talking later in the day. We saw some very interesting data on financial flows, and this is just a question of clarification. Did those financial flows include what I think is a very important and growing phenomenon, which are remittances from workers working abroad? And one of the reasons to distinguish that source of financial flows, as I understand it, is that those flows tend to not be pro-cyclical but counter-cyclical. That is to say, the diaspora of temporary workers and not so temporary people who have left the countries have been playing an important role in helping countries out during financial crises. What is the importance of those flows in the global perspective?
Thank you very much. See, we had someone in the corner back here next to, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question for Jerry Epstein. I'm a former student of his. She was now. So Jerry, you're suggesting that monetary policy should be used more to promote economic growth and employment rather than targeting inflation. But we've seen in countries like Japan the past decade or so where short-term credit rate is near zero, and yet that has not led to a resurgence. There's, maybe economies are stuck in what Keynes called liquidity trap, pushing against a string or whatever. So what have been the real success stories of using monetary policy to promote growth? Even the last 2-3 years in the US has not been very helpful.
Thank you. One more.
Hi, Dilip Mukherjee from Boston University. Regarding sort of international development institutions, the arguments put forward by the speakers suggest the importance of regional development banks. So, if there are problems reforming the World Bank, why not work through the Asian Development Bank? So the question is, what are the constraints in the emergence of such regional development banks?
Thank you very much. So we've got very interesting questions about about stakeholders in some of these processes, about remittances, about inflation targeting, and about the extent to which regional development banks might be part of a reform agenda. Why don't each of you that feels like you want to answer or discuss any of these questions, starting with Robert, since he went first, we'll go through. And I've been drinking good coffee too. Maybe I'll say something.
I'll come later. You ask Amar.
Okay, we'll start with Amar.
Thanks. Let me bring in with the issue of stakeholders. And in a sense, I just want to maybe step back and say that a lot of the decisions that affect the global economy these days is being made by the G20. And I say it because it's not a fully representative grouping. Having said that, it's a lot better than the G7. So on the question that was asked about rules of the financial system, it's the G20 and the Financial Stability Board where at least I see most of the decisions being made. And I also, to put it again somewhat controversially, I would say that the discussions are very, very different than they were before the crisis. I do not hear central banks make the case for let's say, a laissez-faire regime anymore. Having said that, there are a lot of tensions, as you know, in the discussions of Basel III, etc. When it comes to the institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to me, the primary issue is recognizing the impact of what I put there on the graph, which is two things. The need for more democratic governance, meaning recognizing that it's not enough to have just $1, one vote, but also one state, one vote, one person, one vote. And the second, in particular in that context, is the need to recognize that the bulk of the people and the bulk of power today rests in the developing world. Second, just quickly on the issue of remittances, I do have another one which looks at remittances, and it makes precisely the point, Mark, that you make, that they have been anti-cyclical. And that's a very, very important part of it. But the governance of those issues really do not come in the same form as the ones I'm talking about, because they are really, in some sense, private self-owned savings. The third question which was raised by Dilip about regional development banks, yes, indeed. The point I'm making is that there must be much more contestability in the system. And you need to, in some sense, break that down within the MDBs, but also, if necessary, for example, creating an infrastructure facility or a climate finance facility that is financed perhaps by the South, and that co-finances with these institutions and does it with very, very different governance structure, for example, as we have had with the climate investment funds. So the more contestability, the better.
First, the question that Amar was talking about stakeholders. I certainly agree with you that it's pie in the sky to think that we can transform these institutions without transforming the political power that govern them. And I agree with you also that many central banks around the world see the world through finance-colored glasses. That is, that their major constituency are financial institutions, domestic and international, rather than farmers, workers, and others. So how to transform that? Well, one has to create mechanisms for more democratic governance of these institutions, for those who are on the outside of them to have more say on the inside. And it depends on the particular context what that means exactly. If you go to a developing country and talk to the central bank that's operating under an inflation targeting regime, as I did, say, for example, in Madagascar, and ask them, what are you doing to promote employment? They say, oh, that's not our department. Go speak to the labor department, labor ministry. So those on community groups, labor unions, the IMF and others who have influence over these institutions have to say to these central banks, yes, that is part of your department. You actually have to start talking to people in the labor ministry about what's the connection between your policy instruments and employment generation. In the United States and Europe, there's a different problem. We just went through a process of financial reform, the Dodd-Frank Act here in the United States and similar things elsewhere. people were mobilized in the grassroots to try to affect those kinds of policies, including to try to change, to some extent, the governance of the central bank. But those initiatives have now been thwarted to some extent because it's all moved to the regulatory process, where it's the lobbyists who have primary ability through millions of dollars invested in lobbying to really create and exploit loopholes in this law. In these laws. The only way that we're going to change the power of finance to govern this institution is for people to be part of the campaign to change it. And there are many campaigns around the world for a Tobin tax, bank taxes, making sure that the Dodd-Frank Act is implemented properly, and so forth. There are many campaigns. So it's not that we can do this. You have to do it. We all have to do it. The second point, Shua's excellent question. Putting our old professor on the spot, which is good. I think one can answer the question about why doesn't loose monetary policy work these days to promote more employment. You can look at Japan in the post-war period right after the Second World War versus Japan now. Right after the Second World War, central bank policy was a complement and part of the whole industrial policy structure. It was governed by that whole structure and was a complement to it, working through and with the government to promote industry, employment, productivity, and so forth. Then what happened was financial liberalization, an attempt to make Japan a global financial center. That led to, through complicated processes, but it basically led to a financial bubble and a crash. Since that time, industrial policy has not been a major aspect of Japan's policy, and therefore central bank policy has not been integrated into that industrial policy. Therefore, low interest rates, near zero interest rates, only then filter through the financial markets and lead to capital outflows and really don't promote domestic employment. What I was trying to say is that central bank policy has to be integrated into an overall government policy for development. Otherwise, if it just works through liberalized financial markets, it's not going to work. And I think Japan presents a good example of that.
Robert.
Okay, on the question of stakeholders, the World Bank and even the IMF is certainly are certainly reaching out much more than they used to NGOs, to civil society. And I won't delay to elaborate that point except to make one heretical point, and that is that as the bank, the fund, other organizations reach out more to NGOs, so the question of NGO accountability becomes more and more pressing. I have myself got a book-length manuscript almost ready called Accountability Gone Wrong, where the accountability is not that of the World Bank going wrong, it's the accountability of NGOs engaged in what was at that time, 1999-2000, the biggest ever NGO campaign worldwide against the World Bank and against the government of China. It's their accountability that went wrong in this particular case. And I've looked in vain for any serious sort of substantive discussion in the literature about NGOs for a serious engagement with how they can be rendered accountable in the same sort of way as they call for the World Bank, the IMF, and other such bodies to be made accountable. I won't elaborate on that point. I want to go on to this question to do with regional organizations. Amar is quite right that we need very much to encourage more contestability, especially of the global organizations. And one way to do that is to boost the regional ones with an emerging role of the global ones as sort of apex bodies for networks of regional organizations. Then there's an interesting question about standards and how much diversity of standards from one region to another there can and should be. However, my final point is that one shouldn't be too starry-eyed about the idea of a radical shift in power to the South, initiatives, leadership coming from the South. Colleagues at LSE have studied 50 institutional organizational innovations of the past 15 years, all of which involve southern countries, all of which benefit the South, such as, for example, and these are public and private, such as, let's say, the World Bank's inspection panel, such as the Global Fund for Polio, such as the Marine Stewardship Council, and so on and so on, 50 of them, and have found that not one of these, not one, came from the South, that is, was initiated and led from the South. There is an enormous North-South governance gap. So far, countries like China, for example, have been very, very reluctant to exercise leadership in bodies like the G20. In the Chiang Mai initiative, this pooling of reserves in East Asia, it has been particularly China that has insisted that the scope for emergency financing just from within Asia be very, very limited, so that countries can use for their own reserves only 20% of their quota from the Chiang Mai initiative. For anything more than 20%, they must go, and this is at China's insistence, they must go to the IMF and get the IMF to approve the policy regime that they're operating on, together with the whole set of IMF conditionalities. So it is China, in this case, that is insisting on a role for the global organizations superordinate to the regional ones. And that's in particular because of the tension between China and Japan. But these regional tensions are present in many other regions as well and are hobbling or limiting the growth of these regional organizations, making them rely more on the global ones. So my bottom line is, don't be starry-eyed about the scope for the autonomous growth of initiatives from the South.
Let me make a few remarks and underscore what Mark Rosenzweig, who's on the fourth panel today, correct? And that's an exciting panel. The data definitely shows that remittances have been counter-cyclical almost by definition. Folks are often leaving countries like Mexico that haven't had great growth performance and have come to places like the United States where it traditionally it had. Although I think the crisis is a different story. If you look at Mexico from 2000 to 2008, remittances back to Mexicans outstripped foreign direct investment every single year, and Mexico received the third or fourth largest level of foreign direct investment among developing countries on an annual basis during that whole period. So this is amazing transfer from Mexican and Mexican American migrants in the United States back to Mexico, and it's one of the only things that held up the country during a significantly low growth period. But if you think about the composition of Mexican migrants in the United States, a lot of them working in the construction industry, a lot of them working in the services industry, a lot of them working in landscaping and so forth, and they were directly linked to the housing boom. And so when that crashed, the percentage of unemployment among Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States is significantly higher than the regular rate in the United States. And there's been a big drop-off in remittances that goes back. So during a crisis, we don't have the counter-cyclical case all the time. I want to follow up on DeLip's comment about, well, should we be looking more at regional development banks? I think one thing to start thinking about and discussing is the extent to which there's a reemergence of national development banking. This was a key component of many developing country development strategies from 1950 to about 1980 with some successes, and there's been a reemergence in a couple countries of national development banking. Of course, we've all heard the story of the Chinese Development Bank, the CDB, which over the past 5 years has lent more money to developing countries than the World Bank has. And Brazil's development bank, BNDES, the National Development Bank of Brazil, has lent more money in Brazil than the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. in these banks are now also doing loans to other Latin American and even African countries, and that's significant. On the Japan question from Jerry's former student, I want to add or accentuate something that was said almost by all three panelists, is that that the banks need to think more about the variety of instruments that they are going to complement with their expansionary policy. The Bank for International Settlements has come out with a recent study that shows that the carry trade, or I should say, when Japan had very low interest rates over the past 10 years to try to get out of its slump, it didn't have complementary policies to be able to keep a lot of that investment in the Japanese economy. And one of the major sources of capital flows in the world economy over the past 5 years was the Japan-Australian dollar carry trade, the Japan U.S. dollar carry trade, which, if you've been reading the press, has started to become vibrant again in the past few days as Japan has gone into another period of low interest rates. I should just define the carry trade. That's sort of borrowing money in a country with low interest rates and then investing it in a country with a high interest rate. You get the carry is the difference between the interest rates. You get a profit on that. You can also get a profit based on the leveraging that the hedge fund or the commercial entity that is involved in the trade. And you can also get another major hit from exchange rate fluctuations in between the so-called carry, and this is done on trillions of dollars a basis, and seeing a lot of bleeding of money from the Japan to other countries during its recovery, and this is exactly what's been happening to a certain extent with the quantitative easing policy, as Jerry said, in the United States, hasn't gone into expanding credit in the United States as much as Ben Bernanke wanted to. It's gone into accentuating asset bubbles in places like Brazil. We'll have one. We're supposed to stop at 10:45. We'll let the boss have the last say.
Certainly not the boss, but thank you for three very, very compelling presentations and excellent ideas in the spirit of sort of not being starry-eyed. Although my last name means exactly that, being starry-eyed, it actually does. But this is for Amar. It's similar to maybe what Robert was saying. I think you're exactly right that there's this shift happening towards developing countries within these international institutions, but it seems to be happening towards some developing countries. And so I wonder what happens to other developing countries. We are still talking about the South as sort of being this one. So when elephants fight, what happens to all the other? So the India and China's rise, but the Bangladesh's and the Malis. Do you think that what you are seeing is a greater systemic shift towards greater developing country interests? Or do you think that it's sort of a power shift amongst the elephants, if you will? So that's my question. The other, I was really sort of intrigued. I think, again, I'm compelled by the argument. It seems that both the first two speakers are suggesting that what we are calling the financial crisis is really an employment crisis. And this links to the other three panels that we'll have. You both have ideas on what the global system does in terms of employment. But do you think if this development issue is to work, if it is to be licked, is the great impetus going to come from global institutions, or is it national and even local motors that will be required to solve the employment? Is the global system the best vehicle? Even though it can do something, is it the best vehicle to tackle the employment crisis?
Amar, we'll let you have the last word.
Well, I thought the employment ones I'll leave to.
Okay.
I really rushed through that particular picture, but let me just put some of the numbers quite starkly on the table in terms of the changing landscape. Between, pretty much 1970 and 2000, the share of the G7 in the world economy rose and then stabilized at around 65%. From 2000 to 2010, the share of the G7 in the world economy went from 65% to 50%. And the numbers that I had over there suggest that it will probably go to around 40% if you assume a degree of convergence between PPP and market prices. And by 2015, the developing countries, the emerging markets and developing countries will be greater significantly greater in the share of the world economy in terms of the global. And that change that has accelerated in this last decade is really a kind of an event changer. So I'm more in the kind of Najm view of life. I am starry-eyed about the prospects for real change of using developing country power for development. Having said that, I want to answer Adil's point that actually in the latest rounds of governance changes in the World Bank, and especially in the IMF, the changes in voice, the accommodation of the BRICS has come largely on the back of other developing countries. So we have called it a distribution from the have-nots to the yesterday's have-nots, rather than a real meaningful distribution away from the G7. And a lot of the analysis that I put forward shows that even on economic power, the shift should be greater. And on top of that, you have a large democratic deficit, which would give power to countries such as Bangladesh.
Jerry, unemployment?
The question about where should the source of development and employment come from, the global level or the national level, of course is a big question, and I don't pretend to have the answer. But I will say this. There is a responsibility at the global level, and particularly the largest and most powerful nations, the United States, the European Union, and so forth. And their responsibility, I think, is mostly of two types. One is, as Keynes might have put it, they're responsible for not creating problems for everybody else. The recent financial crisis started in the United States and then spread to the rest of the world. The United States and the other major countries, by, among other things, getting their financial systems under control, have to stop creating so many problems for the rest of the world, number one. Number two, in addition to stop spreading bad finance, I think the major countries have to stop spreading bad ideas. Through the IMF and through my own profession, the economics profession, which I think is responsible for some of this, and create more space for developing countries to develop their own ideas that work well in their own countries, and some stability so that they're not always having to react to the problems created by the US and Europe. But the larger question, I think, is very complicated. But those are two things I think there is a responsibility for the developed countries to create a good environment for development among the rest of the world.
Okay, on the shift in power in the multilateral organizations, remember that there are, in the G20, there are no low-income countries. Now that India has graduated from low-income to middle-income, there are no low-income countries in the G20. The low-income countries as a group lost in the voting reforms in the IMF of 2010. They actually lost slightly at about the second, or was it the first decimal point? Amar knows this stuff in his sleep. They lost out, and the shift in voting was mainly a small reduction in the shift in the share of votes of the advanced countries, and a gain by a number of the bigger middle-income countries like the BRICS and Turkey and some others. So that's the nature of the shift. Nobody is really talking for the low-income countries. And just one final point. Again, don't be starry-eyed. Amar talked with great exuberance about the convergence, and Martin Wolf at the Financial Times had 2 columns in January, the first of which was called In the Grip of the Great Convergence. You have to be careful about this convergence stuff, because there is such a thing as the middle-income trap. And a good example of a country stuck in the middle-income trap is Malaysia. Shahid Yusuf, who is or was at least a long-time World Bank economist, a maverick World Bank economist like Amar was, has written a book called Tiger Economies Under Threat. And Shahid has shown how, in the case of Malaysia, but also other Southeast Asian countries, they are stuck in the sense that they are heavily reliant on subsidiaries of foreign corporations operating in their territory, but these corporations are not generating spillovers into the national economy in the form of, for example, the construction of a national innovation system. That kind of spillover is simply not happening, so they are remaining in the position of sort of subcontractors in the world economy to Western and Japanese firms. When you see all these, the kind of figures that Amar showed, the increase in percentage of world GDP going to developing countries, be careful. You have to go behind those numbers. You have to X-ray them and look at the structures of the middle-income countries. They're not developing into centers of innovation, which could seriously challenge value added in the North.
Thank you. Well, before we thank our panelists, let me do two housekeeping things. First, to the chairs of the next sessions, I want you to know that I've led by example, and we're ending exactly at 10:45, and I hope that all the other panels end exactly on time as well. Secondly, after we thank our panelists, we're going to take a 15-minute break. There are refreshments in the back, good coffee and conversation. And we will spend the rest of the day, hopefully we'll have this, the macroeconomic and governance envelope in our minds as we think about some of the more on-the-ground sort of micro aspects of economic development for a better longer-range future. Let me, please join me in thanking our three panelists for a very rich opening discussion.